Joe, welcome to the Science and Chill podcast. Glad to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
Absolutely. So before we get into talking about our topics today, can you give listeners a brief introduction to yourself? Maybe talk a little bit about your educational background, your journey in science, and then let people know where you're at now and what you're working on.
Yeah. So I completed my undergraduate degree in exercise science at Salisbury University. There I got some exposure to research and kind of lit the fuse to sort of send me along the path for a PhD. And I did that at the University of Delaware, working with Bill Farquhar. We studied cardiovascular regulation and health. And I did a postdoc at UT Southwestern Medical Center, studying integrative human physiology. And right now I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Nutrition and Integrative Physiology at Florida State University.
Awesome. And I didn't wear this hat, but I almost wore my Gators hat today just for you,
Yeah.
but I decided to leave it off.
Sure, that's okay.
So yeah, and you're doing very cool things at FSU right now, or at least have grants and plans to do very cool things, and we'll discuss a lot of that. I'm curious too, something you didn't mention is that you have also been kind of very involved in science communication, and that's, I feel like, how I almost came to either meet or know about you, is because we were both writing for this blog for the American Physiological Society, and you're very active on Twitter and kind of have your own website. So when did you get involved in sort of sharing science and kind of this public outreach? Because I know that is something that's very important to you as well.
Yeah, so my first exposure to it probably was through Bill Farquhar, my PhD mentor. And at the time, he had written a little bit every once in a while for I Spy Physiology, that blog that we were sort of alluding to. And over time, I thought that was a really neat thing to just dig into other topics, particularly it's a lot less intimidating to read 2 or 3 paragraphs about some interesting topic than to try to dig through a 60-page review paper. So it was a nice way to sort of expose yourself to new research. So that sort of drew my interest to do that. And then of course, I, as you mentioned, created a website to sort of write about things that I'm learning about, interested in. So that's pretty much where it got started.
Yeah, and I'm sure, I think that it helps a lot being able to have that extra skill set of science communication, because a lot of the work that you're doing is important, and being able to translate it into not only is it good for when you're writing grants and things like that, which you've also been successful in securing, but when you're trying to tell the public how are these findings applicable and why are they important, I think it's a necessary part of science. And so I, for one, can certainly appreciate what you're doing. And I think, I would encourage everyone to check out your lab's website, where you have a public outreach page where you sort of break down some of the studies in your lab and some studies that have just been published in journals and things like that. But it's always been something I've been, very interested in following your work and your science communication throughout the years. So one of the primary topics you mentioned, you're a cardiovascular physiologist by training, and so a lot of the work that you've done in your undergrad and even now has focused on blood pressure. So I'd like to get into sort of blood pressure and the factors that affect it and why it's important, just as sort of an intro, maybe for listeners who may not be familiar with, everybody knows what blood pressure is, but why it's important and sort of what regulates blood pressure. So can we just talk about, for one, when we hear the word hypertension or high blood pressure, kind of what that means physiologically, and what are some of the factors that are regulating blood pressure in the body?
Sure. So a lot of people are probably familiar with systolic and diastolic blood pressure, systolic being sort of the top or higher number, and diastolic being the lower or bottom number. And hypertension is, at least now, defined as a systolic above 130 for systolic and 80 for diastolic. And the reason why that's important is because if you're classified as having hypertension, it's critical that you get treatment to reduce blood pressure, because there's a variety of epidemiological studies suggesting that hypertension is associated with stroke, heart attack, and a whole host of other comorbidities related to the cardiovascular system and also other systems, particularly the brain, the kidney, and other organ systems.
And it's interesting because, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, but I think weren't the hypertension guidelines recently redefined, where they sort of lowered the threshold for what's considered elevated hypertension? Pretty much anything over, I think 120 over 80 is considered elevated hypertension right now.
Right. Yeah. So right now, 120 over 80 is, so if you're above 80 or 120, you're classified as having elevated blood pressure. Whereas previously, when I was at the University of Delaware, our threshold for hypertension was 140 over 90. And I think just given the vast amount of data just showing that lower is better, of course, to a point, and maybe we'll get to that a little bit later,
Mhm.
but certainly getting down to 110 over 70 is monumentally better than 120 over 80. Or above those thresholds, which is why they're really trying to catch people and keep them below those limits.
Yeah, certainly, certainly. And um, are you aware of any of the stats on sort of the prevalence of hypertension in, say, maybe, we can focus on the US or we can think about like worldwide, but what's the prevalence of hypertension? And given the caveat that, since the redefining of hypertension, obviously that's going to put more people kind of in that hypertensive category, but what are kind of the stats on like how many people are hypertensive?
Yeah, so in America right now for adults, it's around 50%. It does vary quite a bit based on how it's measured and what sort of population you're dealing with. And the incidence of hypertension increases with age. So in folks over the age of 65, the incidence can be high as 8 out of 10 people or 4 out of 5 people. So it can be quite predominant.
Yeah, and I'm sure this is something that we'll talk about later as well, but you say 50% kind of hypertension. That seems to parallel the incidence of things like obesity, diabetes, where it seems like we're getting up into that, around 50% of people have maybe obesity or overweight or diabetes. And
Right.
so kind of that clustering of risk factors that often come together, hypertension, overweight, and things like that. But that's something we'll get into as we discuss some of your current work later for sure. You mentioned, you know, up to a point, lower blood pressure is better. And so this is a question that sometimes people always ask me, or if they come to me, and say, oh, here's my blood pressure, like, is this good? Or, how low is too low? So you mentioned that, how low is too low when it comes to blood pressure? And, we always think of the detrimental effects of high blood pressure, and we can kind of go back to that in a second, but what could the detrimental effects of low blood pressure be, and what might be something that would be considered like a too low of a blood pressure?
Yeah, so a threshold that I think has been thrown around a little bit is 90 over 50 for the lower limits. Um, and it starts to become problematic as you get below that, particularly with things like orthostasis, which is simply just the act of standing. So, many people may not appreciate the fact that every time you stand up, about a water bottle's amount of blood actually falls from your central cavities down to your lower limbs. And if you're already just on the threshold of maintaining perfusion through blood pressure to your brain and other organs, that could be problematic, of course, to not have blood flow for any amount of time, of course. So then you get into issues with syncope and dizziness and lightheadedness. And it would be really unfortunate for that to result in a fall, which of course isn't great. So that would be sort of the detrimental effects. And 90 over 50 is about what most people would consider about that threshold.
Yeah, for sure. I've never, measured mine in the case when this like might happen, but I'm one who sometimes experiences, particularly if I'm dehydrated, the orthostatic
Right.
hypotension. So it's like, maybe I've done like the sauna for a little too long or something, and you stand up, you're like, oh man, you gotta sit back down for a while. So usually an indication that I need to drink a little bit more water probably, or something like that. But certainly, certainly maybe not as risky as high blood pressure, but like you said, low blood pressure, especially maybe for older adults and people like that, if you could risk falling or passing out from low blood pressure, that could certainly be a risk there. But what about the detrimental effects of high blood pressure? So hypertension is obviously bad, but like, what are some of the detrimental effects in the body of high blood pressure? We can get into things like damage to certain organs and other things like that, but what are some of the main effects of high blood pressure over time, kind of the chronic negative effects of high blood pressure?
Yeah, so there's a variety, and you sort of alluded to different organs. One example would be the kidney, another would be the brain. And there's this thought that generally the high pressure that the vasculature has to deal with. So obviously you have the heart pumping and you have blood vessels, so you can think of a hose. And if you keep adding pressure to that hose, of course, the amount of elasticity, it'll stretch. And the adaptation, of course, is to make it stiffer. And if you have an adaptation to have a stiffer vessel, then that comes with its own host of issues over time. And the higher arterial stiffness is a component of aging, but there's certainly modifiable risk factors like exercise and diet that can sort of attenuate that change. So that'd be an example of vascular stiffening, for example, that'd be detrimental over time.
Yeah, and it's funny like to think about, as I've learned about all these concepts like, arterial stiffness and studied vascular dysfunction during kind of like my training, we always have this term. It's like, oh, it's a natural part of aging. And I'm like beginning to kind of think that that's less true the more I learn about, people who say maintain a regimen of exercise like throughout their lives, or are eating, a general, this is a weird term, but like a healthy diet, like something like maybe a Mediterranean diet or a diet that's low in sugar. Like it doesn't seem like, arterial stiffness, sometimes if you have these individuals, it's, not any more elevated than like a younger individual and their vascular function. So, you measure something like flow mediated dilation or any other measure of kind of peripheral vascular function, they seem to be somewhat normal. So are you kind of, maybe, do you share that sentiment? Whereas like what we commonly think of natural parts of aging are maybe more so effects of lifestyle that change with age, or how do you kind of think about that? And maybe same thing goes with blood pressure. We have this common notion, oh, blood pressure, it just increases with age. But I've seen like some very interesting studies in, say, like hunter-gatherer tribes, and I say studies, but maybe it was just one study where it's like there's not really this rise in blood pressure. It kind of stays around like 100 to 110, like mostly throughout their life, which would indicate maybe they don't have as much arterial stiffening, vascular dysfunction with age, which likely is a result of sort of their more natural, I guess, lifestyle.
Yeah, and I would agree with that notion on a general basis. Of course, there's genetic components as well, and to what extent the whole genetic versus lifestyle argument, whatever camp you're in, but clearly there's an interaction with both. But I would agree. And, just a couple of weeks ago, I think I saw Mike Joyner and Peter Attia's podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that he was talking about was some of the classic studies with Olympians versus recreationally trained athletes. And of course, the Olympians tend to live longer. And I'm pretty sure he mentioned that even those who medal in the Olympics have better longevity than those who just attend or participate in the Olympics. So, VO2 max, at least as a general surrogate, whether or not it's actually VO2 max or all the other factors that go into having that capability, clearly there's some physiology occurring there. So it's inevitable, but we can definitely change the slope of what happens over time, I think, more than we might imagine, just generally.
Yeah, the nature kind of versus nurture argument is always very interesting, because it's like, even with like the longevity thing, there's all this kind of data now, like, yeah, higher VO2 max is associated with a better longevity, but we know there's a significant, and Mike Joyner has written a lot about that, like a significant genetic component of VO2 max. So it's like, okay, so is it, yes, VO2 max is important, but is it training that got you to the VO2 max? Is it genetics that got you to the VO2 max? But I found that discussion interesting of the longevity and like the Olympians and even those who medal, because I'm sure you're aware of sort of the kind of debate that high intensity, prolonged exercise throughout life may be like detrimental for cardiovascular health. And none of that data would support that at all. Like the higher kind of calcification, if these Olympians who are at the pinnacle of extreme exercise training are like living longer, I think that would say something about like, well, maybe it's not as detrimental to health. So, and I'm less convinced about that. I've heard some things from Ben Levine and even, with Joyner on Peter Attia. I think they discussed that a little bit, and Attia had a couple other people on, but, just discussing the data. I don't think we know I don't think we have a lot of final kind of information on that, but it's like, I'm not as convinced that the detrimental effects of like exercise on cardiovascular health are necessarily having an adverse effect on longevity. So not sure if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was just going to mention actually, just as recently as 2 weeks ago at the Integrative Physiology of Exercise meeting from ACSM. So Ben Levine, who's a world-renowned cardiologist, physician researcher in human physiology and performance and health. And he actually was the chair of a session just getting at that topic, how much is too much bad in regard to exercise, longevity, and cardiovascular health. And there's a lot of conflicting data, a lot of issues with some of the analyses that I think have been done previously, but I think he definitely shares the notion that aside from atrial fibrillation due to sort of the stretching that occurs with all that volume moving through the heart so often, it doesn't really seem to be anything overly compelling to suggest that it is detrimental.
Yeah, that's interesting. I unfortunately missed that meeting, but I wonder if they'll be doing kind of like sometimes they'll publish like reviews of like certain sessions. So I'd be excited if they were to publish something like that. But there's plenty of kind of reviews out there, and Levine has published a lot on that. But it's a super interesting topic, and obviously one that I am sort of passionate about and have a bias towards, because you don't want to, being an endurance athlete, you don't want to say, oh, what I'm doing is like damaging my heart. So we all kind of have our
Right.
battles that we're gonna defend.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to maybe kind of move along and segue a little bit into some of your more recent work that you did during your postdoc. So you ended up studying blood loss and pain medications and things like that, which might seem kind of random and maybe a diversion from your typical research track. So how'd you get into studying pain medications?
Yeah, so it was pretty interesting. My postdoctoral mentor, Craig Crandall, has done a lot of work with the Army in the past. And when I was joining the lab, they were just getting a study off the ground, looking at the effects of different pain medications and how they affect cardiovascular regulation. And the reason is because the analgesics or pain medications that they were using in battlefield settings, a lot of the data were really derived from studies in animals. And there wasn't too much known about how they affect the cardiovascular system, particularly when you're in a hypovolemic or low blood volume state as a result of hemorrhage or blood loss from trauma or injury. So we ended up doing a whole host of studies in the lab, and we, of course, we didn't bleed people out or induce trauma or anything, but there's a technique that you can essentially lay somebody down and put their lower body in a chamber, and then you connect a vacuum to it and then just turn on the vacuum, and that creates suction. And just like standing, some of the blood from your upper body will go down to your lower body. So it's a nice way to simulate hemorrhage. And interestingly, I'll also mention that at the Mayo Clinic, they actually did a blood removal study and compared it to the effects of this vacuum chamber approach. And they found that it was the relation with the physiological responses were quite well tracking with each other. So it is a valid measure. In any case, we would essentially work with an anesthesiologist to test several different pain medications to see if they affected how the body deals with blood loss. As you can imagine, there's a coordinated response to try to, of course, vasoconstrict and maintain perfusion pressure to your vital organs like your brain and other areas that are needed. So yeah, it was pretty interesting to work with that. All those medications, we tested ketamine, fentanyl, and morphine, and each of those we did about 30 people. So over the course of that and a placebo arm, it was around 175 trials over the course of the 3 drugs. So a lot of testing, and for each of those, we essentially would increase the suction in the lower body chamber until someone had signs of pre-syncope. So it's when their blood pressure dipped below 80 millimeters of mercury for systolic. So again, sort of that threshold of 90. But here we were looking at sort of the decompensation point. When does the body hangs on, and then all of a sudden blood pressure just starts to plummet, and that's when we turn the vacuum off, and people return just fine after a couple of breaths. They don't go unconscious or anything. In some cases, they don't even notice that their blood pressure had dropped. They're just laying there and just going with the flow.
Yeah, and so when you're doing this this like lower body negative pressure thing, when they get to that sort of 80 millimeters of mercury pressure, is there like a correlate to like how much blood loss like that would be equivalent to, or is there a way of like figuring that out?
Yeah, so we did a staged approach. So every couple of minutes, we would increase the suction a little bit more, and providing minus 40 or 40 millimeters of mercury of negative pressure, so minus 40 in the box, that's about equivalent to losing about a liter of blood. And on average, the folks would typically finish at about 60 millimeters of mercury of negative pressure. which if you drew the line from 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, it'd be somewhere in the ballpark of 1.5 liters or so, with some variability, of course. We actually had one individual who during the placebo trial, we went all the way to minus 100, and we hung out there for, I think, an additional 6 minutes, because that was the maximum that we decided for the chamber, for safety and whatnot. And they didn't have pre-syncope, so we just, okay, well, you passed the test, I guess. You'd be a great pilot. No issues with sort of blood flow coordination in the body. But yeah, and then some people, I actually was a relatively low tolerant person. So, for me, perhaps anywhere from half a liter to a liter doesn't do too well for me. But yeah, there's a lot of variability.
Yes. So you got to try out the negative pressure thing. You actually got in there and tested it.
Yep. Yeah, it's an interesting feeling. I don't recall exactly what I felt, but some of the typical things are pretty similar to what you would experience when you stand up. If you've ever had that sensation of being a little lightheaded or a little bit dizzy, sometimes people get a little bit, I guess, either sweaty or pale in the face, where they just feel sort of off. But there's a variety of things. But I will say that anecdotally for me, I'm similar to you. Is if I'm in the heat and I'm exercising, I'm a little dehydrated, I think those sensations are a little bit stronger than anything I experienced during the lower body negative pressure testing. But of course, that's very carefully controlled. We're measuring your blood pressure for each individual heartbeat with a specialized finger blood pressure device. So there's a lot of things monitored throughout that to make sure it's safe and everything's good.
No, for sure, for sure. I think that I think any scientist who's doing like a research study, they should have to do, whatever protocol like they're doing. It's like if you're running VO2 max tests, you should have at least gone through one VO2 max test yourself, so you know what it's like. And all jokes aside, I think that it is very valuable because in the process of recruiting participants and consenting them and things, you have to describe all of these methods. And so it's like, if you've done it yourself, you can really tell them, here's what to expect, it's safe. And, and then, if they ask you like, have you experienced it or what should I expect from this? Then you kind of know, what's going on. So definitely. And it's always fun to kind of know what the participants are feeling as well when you're doing certain protocols.
Right.
You mentioned that you tested, so it was ketamine, morphine, and
fentanyl.
So what were some of the effects of them individually, if the effects on kind of blood loss were different? Could you give us maybe a quick summary of the effects of these different drugs?
Sure. So ketamine ended up raising blood pressure and heart rate a little bit. Just at rest. So after it was administered before the lower body negative pressure testing, and that continued. So in other words, blood pressure and heart rate stayed a little bit higher. But as far as the compensation point where your body decides it's no longer going to compensate and things tank, the time, even though blood pressure was a little bit higher, the time course was actually the same. So we would consider that the cumulative stress of negative pressure that people could tolerate wasn't different between their placebo and ketamine trial. So whether or not that has protective effects longer term, because maybe it's providing a little bit more blood flow to those tissues, that's a little bit outside of the scope for us, but at least our conclusion was it's not detrimental, which is just as important. And then for fentanyl, there is not really a lot of effect on the cardiovascular variables or tolerance. And then for morphine, there is a substantial 30 to 40% reduction in tolerance. So from those data, what we concluded was that if a medic in the field or a civilian in a pre-hospital setting has those options, they should consider the fact that morphine might be detrimental to their body's ability to deal with blood loss. So, and the guidelines have suggested those three drugs. And they were suggested when we started the study. Since then, there's been a little bit more evidence to sort of knock morphine anyway for other reasons, because it can be a vasodilator, which you don't necessarily want in the setting of blood loss. But in any case, it's good to see the experimental sort of empirical evidence in humans to support those recommendations.
No, certainly. And I'm glad you kind of added that on, because I was going to ask, what are sort of the applications of this, because I'm sure this is a question that the government or whatever, the military is interested in learning more about. And so, it's neat to see, and I'm sure as a researcher too, to see that your findings are being supported by the recommendations, or perhaps like vice versa, that maybe your findings are actually informing the recommendations. So are you aware of that at all? Like, I'm sure other people are maybe working on similar projects, but was this work funded by say like the
Yep.
Department of Defense or something?
Yeah, exactly. The Department of Defense, US Army specifically. And there was a group that was doing parallel studies in animals where they can do a little bit more mechanistic work and measure some other things that we can't measure in humans. But going back to those guidelines, what I didn't mention, which is important, is that fentanyl and morphine were actually in the same category of may not be the best choice if blood loss is an issue. But our data would suggest that fentanyl might be able to be put with the ketamine, where blood loss is an issue. These are still good analgesics that don't seem to have a detrimental effects on your body's ability to deal with blood loss. So whether or not that study alone will suggest any changes in the guidelines, I'm unsure, but we have a paper under review to sort of summarize all those trials that we did. So hopefully that'll be out soon. It's in Pre-Hospital Emergency Care Journal. So we'll see how people respond to it, and perhaps others will either confirm or deny those findings, and hopefully just advances what we know about it to sort of help people.
Yeah, certainly. And in any case, it sometimes takes a while for the guidelines recommendations to reflect kind of the science. Typically there's a little bit of a lag. It's not immediately like, oh, this, they published this data, we're going to immediately reform the recommendations and publish them. So, maybe
Right.
a few years down the line, like you said, once those findings have been confirmed and things like that. But that's all very interesting. And again, that's not necessarily an area that I'm typically that I'm like well read on, the syncope, blood loss, and the pain medications. But it's cool to hear about kind of some of that research that you did there. And I wanted to, be sure to touch upon that today. But now I want to jump around again and kind of get into a new topic. All of these kind of share a theme of, blood pressure, blood loss, things like that, cardiovascular regulation. But one of the other major topics that you investigated, and I think this was during your PhD at Delaware, right?
Right.
Was salt sensitivity and blood pressure. So this is a very interesting topic for me, and I've learned a lot reading papers from your lab and Dr. Farquhar, and then Austin Robinson too. I interviewed him very early on in my podcast, and just like learning from all of his papers has been very interesting because salt, I think it's funny because it's like a very controversial topic. You'll hear associations like American Heart Association and things like that. Yeah, they're recommending against intake of, too high salt intake. And most people, if you ask them, about salt, they'll say, yeah, you probably shouldn't eat too much salt. But then you'll get people who say, well, yeah, obviously salt is necessary. We need sodium. And I say salt, I kind of more so mean sodium, I guess, but you need sodium to live. Obviously, it's important for neurotransmission and everything in our body. Our body needs sodium. So it's like this very divisive topic in a way, and maybe I just say that because of what I'm aware of. But salt definitely has effects on the cardiovascular system and on blood pressure and cardiovascular regulation. So when we ingest sodium, and maybe say we ingest a little too much sodium, can you just talk about like what happens in the body, cardiovascular wise, to regulate that sodium, and then what some of maybe the detrimental effects of too much sodium could be on blood pressure?
Sure. So there's definitely a controversy in this field. There's books published that support that you should overeat sodium, and it's critical that you get several thousand milligrams per day. And I guess just to provide a little bit of context for some of the studies we did that I can speak to. So as you mentioned, the AHA, American Heart Association, recommends no more than 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day. And the dietary guidelines for America suggest 2,300. So that's about where the recommendation would be, somewhere either below 2,300 or 1,500. And the average American adult consumes about 3,600. So more than twice of the AHA recommendation, and still significantly more than the dietary guidelines for America. But in any case, what happens when you overconsume salt is the body responds by just trying to get rid of that extra salt. So a lot of the sodium you consume is just excreted through the urine. So it's processed through the kidneys. And what becomes problematic is when the body can't do that. If you consume so much salt, for example, that the body now needs to either change the hormonal profile of the body or expand the plasma volume to respond. So that just means that with more sodium on board in the body, if you're drinking more water, then you just have a higher plasma volume, and the fluid in the body can increase. And as far as blood pressure, there is a salt sensitivity of blood pressure where some individuals have a heightened blood pressure after they eat more salt. So that means that for a given individual, if you go from a low salt to a high salt diet, your blood pressure might change by 5 or 10 millimeters of mercury, which can be quite significant, particularly if you're near a threshold for treatment. So heightened blood pressure is certainly something that's not a great thing to have. And Bill Farquhar, along with Dave Edwards, who's at the University of Delaware, they did a lot of work early on to show the blood pressure independent effects of blood pressure and how it can have negative impacts on the brain, the kidney, and also vascular function. So flow media dilation, which we were alluding to earlier, that's another variable that can be reduced with high salt diets. So that's essentially the endothelial cells and vascular health markers.
And so you mentioned, obviously, so when we intake salt, the body responds by increasing salt excretion. So, so what goes wrong when, I guess, why isn't all of the salt, say, that we eat above a certain point excreted? So what kind of goes wrong, or what's like the pathophysiology behind why either salt causes this increase in blood pressure, this plasma volume expansion? Why don't we just excrete all of the excess sodium that we are taking in?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not exactly clear, but there's certainly something to do with the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So with a high salt diet, you would suppress those hormones, and perhaps for different individuals, particularly who don't have normally functioning kidneys or as responsive to that change. So for example, aging is associated with a reduced sensitivity to those changes in blood electrolytes, and also a reduction in how the kidneys can respond to those blood electrolytes. So things like aging and other factors that might be associated with certain disease states, those individuals may be at risk for not being able to clear all that sodium.
Got it. And that's pretty much what gives us the salt sensitive kind of hypertension phenotype, or so I guess someone who is salt sensitive, they would have some dysregulation in renin-angiotensin aldosterone signaling, or maybe they have kidney disease or something like that. Or is there other kind of well-known, maybe genetic components or something to salt sensitivity?
Yeah, there might be. That's a little bit outside my wheelhouse, to be honest, as far as genetic components. But as I mentioned, vascular function, for example. So if the heart is pumping the same amount, whether it's a higher plasma volume for the same amount, if the vasculature is a little bit functionally stiffer or not as able to dilate with a high salt diet, I mean, that by itself, you have a less elastic vessel. Of course, pressure will then increase. So all those effects. And also there's some ideas related to inflammation being increased with salt as well. So that's a whole host of effects on multiple organ systems that can sort of explain part of the interplay as well.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that surprised me when I was, when you look at what salt is recommended or how much sodium is recommended, that 1300 to 2500 kind of milligrams, it's like a surprisingly tiny amount. I mean, it's like a teaspoon of salt, I think, is 1500 milligrams or something like that.
I always get confused, tablespoon and teaspoon, but I think you're right. A tablespoon or a teaspoon, sorry, is about 1500. I think that sounds right.
Yeah, I definitely don't think a tablespoon would be a lot of salt. A tablespoon is probably a couple thousand milligrams. But I mean, it's just weird because, when you become aware of it, not that I by no means really watch my salt intake. I'm not necessarily worried about it. I sweat a lot, exercise a lot, and I'm not worried about my blood pressure being too high. But, when I just think about like, if I make dinner or make a steak or something, how much salt I'm putting on that, I mean, at least 2 teaspoons. So it's just crazy how, when you really are aware of like this many milligrams of sodium are in this teaspoon of salt, it's like, oh man, it's no surprise that people are eating way too much because it's not, that much sodium.
Yeah, and what's good to mention too is for folks who might overeat sodium, and say, oh, well, I'll just, use a quarter of a teaspoon instead of a whole teaspoon on my steak next time. It turns out that about 70% of most people's dietary sodium comes from prepackaged foods. So in other words, sodium that comes to you before it hits the table or gets into the fridge. So things like restaurant meals are pre-prepared, and they tend to have a high amount of sodium. So if you're doing home cooking with you're sort of starting off with non-prepared ingredients, typically the sodium content isn't too high because it would just be the naturally occurring amounts in the foods. So that's just probably something that might be helpful for people to know as well.
No, for sure. I think that's definitely one of the primary source, as you mentioned, of like sodium in the diet is prepackaged foods, not necessarily what people are adding. And then of course, if you are adding salt to already like prepackaged stuff, it's definitely no surprise that we're getting a lot. Researching this stuff or having researched this stuff, are you kind of conscious of your sodium intake, or do you like, watch how much sodium you're intaking, or, how do you go about it? Just kind of being aware of this data for your own self.
Yeah, I certainly went through phases where I would track things pretty carefully, and it sort of fades away and then comes back. But I think for me, I don't eat a lot of processed foods or prepackaged foods generally. So my sodium intake is probably close to 1,000 milligrams per day. So I'm not too concerned. But it's certainly something I look at. So for example, like pasta sauce, if you're looking at the pasta sauce aisle and you have a few options, every once in a while I'll dig in and say, okay, what's the sodium content of this sauce versus that? And sometimes it's quite remarkable how there'll be 800 or 900 milligrams per serving, whereas another might have 300 or 400 milligrams per serving. And that's not the only thing to consider, but if all else is equal, then that's just an easy way for you to avoid an extra 1, 2, or 3,000 milligrams of sodium, depending on how much you eat.
No, for sure. And that's typically, that's how much per serving. And sometimes the serving
Right.
size is like incredibly small. So maybe it's like a fourth a cup of pasta sauce. Well, you might have 1, 2, 3 cups of pasta sauce. So yeah, certainly for people who are watching their sodium intake, getting the low sodium options is definitely kind of something, a reasonable strategy there. It was funny when I think it was last year, maybe a few semesters ago, Austin Robinson came and did a lecture at UF where he was talking about some of his research, and we went out to dinner afterwards. And we were like eating dinner, and he was very conscious of like, I'm here like spooning salt onto my like steak or something, and he's like eating fries and got them like without salt. So it was just funny because I was like, I could tell that he was being aware of like the salt, but again, just like you mentioned, he's researching all of this stuff. And so I just thought that was kind of funny. I'm like, of course, the salt researcher guy. And I felt judged as I was spooning salt onto like everything I was eating.
Yeah, it's tricky with nutrition research sometimes for that reason, because it's so, you have meals with people and you eat several times a day, and it's something to think about a lot. So you talk about that for my dissertation work, I did some studies with dehydration, and it's so hard not to read about dehydration 6 hours a day and not carry a water bottle around and drink the recommendations. And so yeah, there's definitely a component to what you study is something that you definitely pay attention to.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Doing, some of my dissertation work on like sleep deprivation. I'm like, well, I can't, you're like being sleep deprived doing the study that you're, studying the negative effects of sleep on cardiovascular health. But yeah, I think that's, fun though. It's like a positive in a way, like conflict of interest that all kind of researchers have, but I think you should, integrate yourself into the research you're doing and apply it to your life. So it's always, it's always fun. So, we talked about salt, but I think sugar is another interesting kind of area that we could talk about. I know that you necessarily maybe haven't done some research in this area, but as far as, maybe comparing, say, the effects of like sugar and salt on blood pressure or vascular function, are you aware of, any detrimental effects of sugar on blood pressure and vascular function, or any of the studies that have been done there?
Yeah, there was an interesting study from 2018 from Shane Phillips' group at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And what they did was they had people challenged with the oral glucose tolerance test, so essentially a large glucose bolus. And they also had people take in a high-fat meal. And typically both of those stimuli, high sugar meal or a high-fat meal, would elicit a reduction in vascular function if you use the flow-mediated dilation as your marker. But what they found was that actually the group who was sedentary did have those reductions as expected, but those who were runners or lifters or cross trainers actually didn't have a reduction in their vascular function after either of those meals. So that's pretty interesting, and it just shows another sort of protective effect of exercise that might accompany reductions in vascular function that might occur with a high salt, or in this case, a high sugar or high fat meal.
Yeah, there certainly are. I think it's pretty profound looking at a lot of the studies, just the protective effects of exercise, not only kind of, the acute effects. So yeah, if you exercise before a high fat, high salt, high sugar meal, that could protect you against some of the dysfunction, the postprandial kind of glucose spikes or vascular dysfunction or blood pressure increase. But the chronic kind of exercise training too just seems to make people more resistant against the effects of whether it's like sugar or salt or fat or whatever. So it's definitely interesting. And I know, you just cited one study there, and I'll try to include that in the show notes, but I think there are, many others that I'm kind of aware of where, again, you take trained individuals or have people who exercise, and like, they don't seem to have the same adverse response to these quote unquote insults that normal people might do. The mechanisms, I'm sure there are a lot involved, but would the primary mechanisms for that, you think maybe more in the sugar realm, but be related to some sort of kind of anti-inflammatory or a reduction in oxidative stress in the people who are chronically exercised? Or, what mechanisms do you think might be responsible for that, if you had to maybe speculate?
Yeah, for sure. Early on in my undergraduate training, one of the professors I had would commonly say that training is just building more enzymes. And what that means is that you're building more enzymes to keep the environment, whether that's the skeletal muscle or other tissues, keeping that environment very carefully controlled, where if you have a stimulus such as a high sugar meal, there's enough going on enzymatic activity, and you have all these factors at play where you can prevent that from being an insult that results in just total chaos in whatever tissue of interest you have. There's also an idea of skeletal muscle, of course, as a place of storage for carbohydrates, where it's known as glycogen. So if you have quote unquote full glycogen stores versus you're depleting those by exercising and utilizing that energy, then it creates a little bit of a reservoir. So this is actually part of something that I think about a lot as far as with aging, for example, we were talking about earlier, what's more important? Is it the muscle strength or the muscle hypertrophy? Because in a way, muscle hypertrophy, having a large amount of lean muscle mass, that's a great reservoir for sugar. And so what should you cater your training to? And the answer is probably both. But yeah, just sort of an interesting thought to consider for that.
No, it is. And I know that's kind of a big topic of discussion. Like, yes, you don't need to be, I think, enormous, you don't need to have bodybuilder type levels of muscle mass as you age. But like you said, it's, a glucose sink, muscle is a glucose sink. And so the more muscle you have, I guess, to some degree, you're going to be able to tolerate a little bit of extra, maybe carbohydrate or sugar in your diet or whatever. But, obviously the quality of that muscle matters more. So, yeah, like you said, you want to train to have a little bit of both, maximize hypertrophy and maximize, muscle strength. So, but yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing to think about, because both mass and strength typically decline with age. I'm not sure if one declines more than the other. I would assume maybe muscle mass, but, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, it's a very interesting thing to think about, and explains a lot about why, our carbohydrate intolerance and whatever probably decreases with age, and why, just the risk of diabetes and anything pretty much increase with age, because muscle mass is declining and typically paralleling decreases in activity levels and things like that.
Right.
So I guess one more thing regarding the protective kind of effects of exercise, or the interaction kind of between exercise and diet. I know that you've done also some work on the effects of like a high salt diet during on blood pressure effects during exercise. So what are some of the effects, say, if you put individuals on a high salt diet? Does that augment, say, the blood pressure response to exercise? Or maybe is it different? Are there people who are, say, salt sensitive in that respect versus people who aren't?
Yeah, so during my PhD at the University of Delaware, another student, Matt Babcock, who's now an assistant professor in Denver, he led a few studies that was looking at that exact question. So he essentially had people go through their habitual diet, and then he added on top of that unmarked pills. And those pills were either filled with dextrose as a placebo or sodium chloride with about 3,900 milligrams of sodium. So this created a paradigm where you had sort of a recommended or habitual salt intake and a high salt intake condition. And when they came into the lab at the end of each diet, the blood pressure response was higher during a bout of acute aerobic exercise after the high salt. So that's not ideal, because high blood pressure responses during exercise are also predictive of future hypertension and cardiovascular disease risk. So that would be a detrimental effect of salt. And what's interesting too is we were talking about the protective effects of exercise. One of those is post-exercise hypotension. So that is, if you were to get up and exercise in the morning, you have an acute drop in blood pressure, anywhere from 5 to 10 millimeters of mercury, around that range. That's not necessarily exact. And that's sustained, or at least somewhat of a sustained, maybe not to that degree, but blood pressure is lower over the course of the rest of the day, the next 12 hours or so, as a result of your exercise bout. And what was interesting is after the high salt condition, the reduction that you would get in blood pressure with exercise was completely attenuated. So it essentially disappeared. So, one of the protective effects of exercise you may not gather with a high salt diet, for example, at least based on those experimental results.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it gets me wondering, like, whether, say that post-exercise hypotension could also be beneficial, say, for people who have like non-dipping blood pressure overnight or something. So, again, I don't know if this has been studied, but, maybe the high salt diet would prevent also that nocturnal, like, dipping in blood pressure, whether it's in general or after exercise. So that could be kind of another way that it might be, one, reducing the negative benefits of or the positive benefits of exercise, but also sort of increasing this overnight risk of having high blood pressure, and then maybe the morning after spike. So yeah, definitely kind of that fascinating interaction there. Are you aware of what the high salt and the low salt arms of that study were? How much sodium people were consuming in the high salt versus the low salt condition?
Yep. So we, or Matt asked them to, excuse me, consume 2,300 milligrams as the recommended. It turns out that their habitual diet was closer to 3,400, which isn't too surprising because that just matches American intake on average. So the recommended salt turned into about habitual salt intake of about the 3,400. And then we added on top of that 3,900, I believe. So that got us to somewhere around between 6,000 and 7,000 milligrams per day as the high salt condition. So that's certainly, 7,000 milligrams is quite high. That's in the, the top few percentile of Americans, but, there are a lot of people in that range. So whether or not it's stepwise or there's a critical threshold, it's unclear, but yeah, I certainly have a lot of questions from those data to continue, as I'm sure Austin Robinson and Matt Babcock do as well.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, 6,000 to 7,000 is certainly quite a lot. And I don't know, maybe you mentioned this, were they older individuals, or were they kind of just younger, healthier individuals? Not that all older individuals are unhealthy by any means, but.
Sure. Yeah, these were all young, healthy adults, mostly college age, 20 to 30 or so.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting. And then they didn't do any, maybe they're doing them now, but they didn't do any of this data in older individuals that you're aware of?
Not to my knowledge, but it would be interesting to see. I guess the only counter argument to that would be, if we know it's bad in young, should we, have old people go through, or people who are older in age go through that? But it could be that they don't have any negative effects, or maybe it is a lot worse, but then that creates a target or something you need to fix, or more rationale to fix. So yeah, there probably is some rationale to at least investigate on a preliminary basis to see what's different.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of a good question of like, not necessarily like, is it ethical, but it's like, oh, if you're knowingly putting them in a situation where, like, their blood pressure might go up like 10 to 15 millimeters of mercury, that could be a risky kind of experiment to run. So if you see detrimental effects in healthy individuals, you almost could assume that it's going to be exacerbated in older individuals, but it's not always the case, but one could probably assume that.
Yeah, but there are, there's studies going on all over the country where people have hypertension, they're on blood pressure reduction agents, And they're asked to come off of those medications in order to study the effects of heat therapy or various other specific medications or training regimen. So, there certainly is some utility to that data. So subjecting in a very carefully clinical environment a few people to the stress to help us understand a guideline recommendation for millions of Americans, then there's certainly at least some rationale for it, depending on how the question is asked and answered, I guess.
Yeah, right. And there are certainly more riskier kind of studies that are being done than just something that's going to elevate somebody's blood pressure. So that's what the IRBs are for, right?
Right, exactly.
Right. All right. So Joe, can you tell us about Gene Dykes?
Yes. So Gene came, well, I guess just a little bit of backstory. So Gene is just a world-class athlete, and he happens to be 70 years old. I guess now he's in his early 70s, but he actually came to the lab when he was 70 years old, and he was fresh off of running a 2:54 marathon, which, if anybody has done marathon running or knows what time you would go for or the times that you've run, is quite fast, particularly for someone of that age. So we brought him in for physiology testing. So what makes him so great? Why can he run so fast relative to others in his age group? And we essentially just characterized his VO2 max, lactate threshold, and also running economy. So essentially, how much energy does he need? So how much oxygen does he consume for a given running velocity? So we had the opportunity to bring him in.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, a 2:54 marathon at age 70 is incredibly fast. That's actually, granted, I haven't, I've only run one marathon in my life, but that's actually my marathon PR. So it's about 6:39 per mile, which is
right.
just blazing fast. I liked the you guys kind of referred to this as like the breaking three study, which was pretty cool. But
Yep.
Incredible world record nonetheless. And Gene is a fascinating guy, and I think he just posted a picture on Twitter with Eliud Kipchoge after
Yep, I showed that in
Kipchoge's
my
marathon.
Yep, yeah, I was talking in a graduate research methods class last week, and I was introducing that running case study as well, that physiology testing, and I said, Gene's just an easygoing, nice guy. And the tweet you're referring to was the one he was up on the podium with Kipchoge, and he said having a chat with Kipchoge, giving him some good advice about running marathons, and
yeah,
just really highlights the sort of easygoing nature and how kind Gene is.
No, yeah, I thought that was funny. He's like, yeah, giving the goat some tips on marathon training.
Right.
So. And I'll post the study in kind of the show notes so people can look at some of the graphs and things. It's a very short read, so a very cool article. If you can recall sort of some of the specifics, what was Gene's VO2 max? And then in particular, I think some of the other parameters that are maybe more important to touch upon are like, what made him so, we'll say, special physiologically? Like, obviously he had, probably for his age at least, an incredibly high maximal oxygen consumption, but his running economy, and then like his lactate threshold, or maybe his, how much oxygen he was consuming for a given pace. I think those were the two variables that stuck out. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we measured Gene's VO2 at right around 47 mLs of oxygen per kg per minute, which is still above average for a 20-year-old male adult. So it's still pretty remarkable that he was able to produce that at age 70. But what's special about Gene likely is more related to his running economy. So of course, that's still an amazing VO2, particularly for his age group. But his ability to maintain and work at a very high percent of that VO2 over the course of a marathon is quite remarkable. So based on the data we collected in the lab, if he were to plot out his running pace with the world-breaking marathon pace, he was at about 93% of his peak oxygen uptake. And you probably are very well versed in the sort of what percent you should be at for each running distance, but that's probably closer to a 5K pace. Typically, you're at around 95 to 100% of VO2 max for a 5K, which can be from 15 to 30 minutes, depending on, or 35 or 40 minutes for most people. And the fact that he held 93% of his pace based on our data for almost 3 hours is just incredible. So the ability to, I guess, Alex Hutchinson, to endure and just maintain that pace is quite remarkable.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think, I will have to dig back into the study. I think it was Andy Jones and them published on, Kipchoge, or a bunch of guys that were involved in the Breaking Two project. But I think one
Hmm.
of the similarities there was that, like, Kipchoge was able to maintain, it was maybe 80, 85% ish of his VO2 max again for that entire marathon distance, which, like you mentioned, Joe, is like incredible, because imagine going and running almost at your maximum, ability, and
Right.
sustaining. I mean, most people couldn't sustain that for more than 20 minutes. You shouldn't be able to sustain it for more than 20 minutes, but
Oh yeah, even
he's,
20 minutes, even a couple of minutes. I mean, if you're
yes,
doing a VO2
miserable.
max,
Right.
yeah,
You
yeah,
get
that
there for
30
about
seconds is
two
a
to three
lifetime.
minutes. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So imagine doing that. I mean, yeah, holding that for multiple hours is just incredible. And I think it speaks to the incredible physiology that is required to have these record-breaking performances, whether you're somebody like Kipchoge, who's 40 years old, or Gene, who's 70 years old. Like, it requires just something extra that, most people don't have. So
Yeah.
what's are you aware of, like, what maybe the average VO2 max of somebody who's like 70 might be? I'm not aware of, like, the numbers, and I'm trying to think,
Yeah,
but I would assume that it's probably in like the high 20s or low 30s, maybe.
that would probably be my guess as well. And also just thinking back to, sounds like you listened to that Mike Joyner, Peter Tia podcast. I think I recall them talking about being in a VO2 of the 20s is about where the break point is, where if you start to have a VO2 max below the mid 20s, or plus or minus 5, that's when your level of independence and ability to do activities of daily living starts to decline, because this is Gene running in a marathon setting at 93% of his VO2 max. Whereas if your VO2 max was 20, and you walking up the stairs to get something from your bedroom is 90% of that, it's not gonna be too great. So I think I recall somewhere in the 20s or low 30s.
Yeah, I think so. So I pulled up, and this may be outdated by now, but I pulled up some norms for men, and this is just from ACSM, and it looks like for age 60 to 69, a excellent VO2 max would be over 38 mLs per kg. So yeah, I mean, he's, well above the excellent, but yeah, I also am aware of kind of the data that you were just citing, that, like, I think something below 20 and then below 15, maybe a number I remember from somewhere, is like basically the threshold for frailty. Essentially, like, you're going to have trouble with activities of daily living, because all of this require, at least that much oxygen consumption to function.
Right.
I find we keep mentioning Atia, but he's like,
Yeah.
I find that his kind of working back kind of strategy, or his backwards thinking on longevity, is sort of very interesting. So it's like, okay, if I want to have, a VO2 of, say I'm 80, and I want to have a VO2 of like 35 or 40, what does my VO2 need to be now? And then, like, get myself,
120. Yeah,
yeah,
just
exactly. It
ridiculous.
needs to be 120 mLs per kg now. So, get it as high as, that just speaks to the getting it as high as possible, because there is the decline. Whether you maintain your activity or not, you're going to have a decline. So starting at that higher point is very important. But back to Gene, I feel like and maybe this was something that I remember from the study, maybe I'm remember getting correctly, but he didn't get into running until like later in life. Is that correct?
Yeah, I remember him mentioning that he didn't really get into it until, yeah, exactly as you said, later in life. So
Hmm.
yeah,
Which
interesting
is in,
tidbit.
yeah, which is interesting. So going back to, our earlier points on nature versus nurture, I'm sure he was someone who was maybe born with a incredibly high VO2 max, but didn't necessarily have do the training early on, or maybe even get involved or interested in running. And, so that ability didn't really come up until he just started. I just always find it funny that people like that, who are successful at that age, are typically not the same ones who are, say, were elite performers early in life, because I think it's hard to kind of maintain that level maybe of performance. So I don't know, maybe the best strategy is to not do anything until you're like 40, and then
Yeah,
really get involved.
save it for the Centenarian Olympics, right?
Exactly. And you can set some world records if you hold off for a little bit.
Right. Yeah.
Um, Anything else, just anecdotally, that you gathered just being around Gene, and maybe, in hearing him chat or whatever? I do know that there was some like qualitative data that you all gathered. And I remember, I think, reading something about, he was like a healthy eater, and he maybe had maybe was doing some intermittent fasting or time restricted feeding type stuff. But anything else like qualitatively that you or anecdotally that you can just remember from him that might explain his exceptional performance?
Yeah, I mean, other than what you mentioned, the only thing that sort of sticks out to me is just, and this isn't uncommon among endurance athletes, but he had a smile on his face, 99.9% of the time. Perhaps, at his VO2 peak, maybe he wasn't smiling, but he had a smile on, and I think just having the easygoing personality certainly helps. And yeah, so that would be the sort of anecdote that I would share.
Cool, cool. And, I think it's fascinating because, I mean, maybe, in 5 years or so, he'll still be running and maybe somebody, maybe you, maybe Austin or whoever else can do another case study on him and kind of have this longitudinal follow-up type stuff. I think that would be, super fascinating. Maybe we can
Yeah,
get it, maybe we can genotype him and all of that. So figuring out the secrets to longevity and performance, that would be fascinating.
right. Yeah.
All right. So last thing I want to talk about, Joe, is your current work and things that you are involved in now. So we've discussed a lot about hypertension and risk factors, maybe dietary and kind of lifestyle factors. But one of the primary things that you seem to be interested in investigating now is the effects of obesity on hypertension, and then some lifestyle factors that may help to mitigate that risk. So can you briefly just sort of talk about this interaction between obesity and hypertension? We sort of already mentioned it. There's high prevalence of obesity in America, worldwide, also a high prevalence of hypertension. But how are these kind of interrelated? I guess in other words, why or how does obesity elevate one's risk for having high blood pressure?
Yeah. So there's a whole host of mechanisms, and just to put a few numbers behind it, since they're fresh in my mind, about 33% of Americans, about 3 in 10 Americans have class 1 or class 2 obesity. And that's a BMI in the range of 30 to 40. And about 9% of Americans have class 3 obesity, which is BMI above 40. So as you mentioned earlier, around 4 in 10, it could be higher. And that's just for obese. Adults with obesity, and there's also an overweight category, 25 to 30 for BMI, and there's a host of people in that category as well. So it might be as much as half of the population. And what's quite alarming is it is growing quite quickly. So as recently as a couple of decades ago, the incidence of obesity was quite lower. But as far as the link, so unfortunately, adults with obesity have a high risk of elevated blood pressure. They have a higher risk for future cardiovascular disease risk, and a whole host of other disease states and comorbidities and all-cause mortality. So those are a few things that sort of link their heightened risk of cardiovascular disease.
Yeah, and so one of the kind of primary, and us, both of us being exercise physiologists, obviously we're kind of gung-ho about, prescribing exercise, and most clinicians and everyone is aware that exercise decreases, well, some would probably disagree with this, but, decreases the risk or can decrease the, obesity prevalence. That seems to have not maybe it has been as an effective strategy as, we would hope. And it seems to be one of the limitations of exercise. We can go on for days and days about exercise is good for this and this and this, but at some point, there are limitations to it. Many of those limitations being time, and then also, people who have metabolic diseases like obesity and things like that. We can admit that exercise is somewhat hard. Not only is like starting an exercise program hard, but just physically the exercise may be harder for someone carrying around kind of excess weight. And so you were investigated or interested in investigating sort of maybe other novel lifestyle interventions that could help to improve blood pressure and sort of physical function in individuals with obesity. And I'm sure they can have other applications too, maybe to individuals who have a lower kind of exercise capacity. And so this may be a replacement for things, where exercise has maybe failed because there are certain barriers to exercise. So what are some of these, and maybe it's just maybe the one, but what are some of these novel approaches that your lab is currently investigating for the treatment of hypertension in individuals with obesity?
Yeah, so as you alluded to, I think there's good data now that exercise is great for preventing weight regain, but as far as weight loss, exercise doesn't seem to be as exciting as we would think. And there's a variety of reasons, as you alluded to, related to infrastructural barriers. So for example, do you have a sidewalk and a safe space to exercise if you wanted to go for a walk? Time, do you have an hour and a half to drive yourself to a gym 15 minutes away, exercise, shower, come home and drive home? And even if you shorten that with this high intensity interval training, that can be quite challenging. And, you either need a bike or a place to run that's safe. And, for those reasons, that makes it tough. And on top of that, you mentioned some of the physical limitations. So if you do have excess body mass, then it could be quite daunting to try to start in one of those exercise training programs. And a lot of times you may not know where to start, or it may be that you might need access to a treadmill or safe space, like I mentioned. But in any case, obesity is associated with something that's called exertional dyspnea, and that is breathlessness. So if you go to exercise or exert yourself, you have a feeling of breathlessness that might make you not enjoy exercise quite as much. So of course, that's a deterrent. And so we talked about time. There's also a cost component. So, having that leisure time certainly has its costs associated with it. And also the ability to do something either in your home or nearby would be helpful. So not needing to go to a gym. And what I found is this training called inspiratory muscle strength training. And this was really pioneered by Dr. Fiona Bailey at the University of Arizona in the past 5 or 10 years. And since then has been picked up from Dr. Doug Seal's group at the University of Boulder, Colorado. And Dr. Daniel Craighead has been leading the charge with IMST, or inspiratory muscle strength training, and blood pressure reduction. So for me, I thought about the cardiovascular aspects and also the physical limitations. And together, I think that creates a nice basis for inspiratory training to actually attack both of those issues. So that is the cardiovascular health improvement by blood pressure reduction, and also potentially changing the physiology of how you breathe, strengthening the respiratory muscles, and reducing that uncomfortable sensation of breathlessness.
Yeah, which would certainly kind of increase just exercise tolerance and maybe increase adherence to exercise, or someone's ability to exercise. So can you describe what this inspiratory muscle strength training is? What's the device kind of look like, and maybe what it feels like? I'm sure you've probably maybe participated or used one of these devices, but what is IMST? Kind of what does a typical protocol look like?
Yeah, so there's essentially a few different devices that are out there, manual or electronic, but essentially it's just a handheld device, a little bit bigger than an inhaler, really. And what it does is it provides resistance when you breathe in. So when you go to inhale, there's resistance to that. So it's a little bit tougher to breathe in, and you sustain that effort of breathing in against resistance until your lungs are full. And you repeat that a few times, and then you can take a break and do it a few more times. And right now, what's prescribed for that training is 30 reps. And 30 reps means 30 breaths of resisted breathing. So yeah, what the training is you use a little device the size of an inhaler, and essentially provides resistance when you breathe in. And what you'll do is breathe in against that resistance a few times, and then you'll do that over the course of a few sets. So that what's prescribed right now is 30 breaths over the course of a few minutes. So now you have a device that's handheld that you can use at home. The manual trainer is not electronic, they don't need to be charged or anything. And you can do it in the course of a few minutes. So I actually do this every morning while I'm just heating up my oatmeal in the microwave. So hit the microwave button and do a few sets of the breathing. So it definitely checks the box for low cost and checks the box for time efficiency. So it's pretty exciting in that it has some pretty remarkable blood pressure lowering effects from some of the pilot studies that are out there so far.
Yeah, and I know Dr. Craighead and his group they published a pretty large study, I think, in maybe adults who didn't even have hypertension. It may have just been like healthy adults, but they showed pretty drastic blood pressure reductions. And like you said, the time wise, I mean, I think they're doing like 5 minutes a day, maybe. It might have been every day per week, or maybe just like 3 days per week, but literally 5 minutes a day. And they reduced their blood pressure something around like 10 millimeters of mercury or whatever. And again, people who maybe in people who don't have necessarily uh, significantly elevated hypertension. Maybe they were kind of like borderline, but I think that's, certainly a profound effect for just like 5 minutes a day. I mean, that's equivalent to like what exercise might be able to reduce in a few weeks.
Right. Yeah. So that was a study of pulling together a few pilot studies that they've done and Dr. Fiona Bailey's done at the University of Arizona. And it ranged from 5 to 7 days of training. So that is Monday through Friday or every day of the week, just the 5 minutes. And the mean blood pressure reduction was 9 millimeters of mercury for systolic, which is quite significant. And what was interesting too is that the variance for how much blood pressure dropped was only explained, or that variance, it was only about 6% of the variance from your starting blood pressure. So that is, if your blood pressure started at 150 or it started at 100, only 6% of the variance in how much it dropped was explained by that initial value. So
Interesting.
it is quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so that would suggest that regardless of what your blood pressure is, it could still, have like a significant benefit. It's not people with higher blood pressure benefit more than people with lower blood pressure at baseline.
Right. Yeah. And, just in the pilot study that we did, it wasn't even a pilot study, it was just a few people who were helping collect some preliminary data. But, somebody went from 106 to the low 90s and somebody else went from the mid 130s to the mid 120s. And that was before this had been published. So it's good to see that a lot of continuity with almost a blood pressure independent blood pressure reduction, which you don't really see too often.
No, for sure. And you mentioned you'd kind of been using this maybe occasionally. Have you noticed anything subjectively or maybe objectively after using this for a decent amount of time?
Yeah, it's really tough because, as I learn about, I'm sure, you mentioned you have interest in this area too. You kind of try things as you learn about them. So my regimen changes quite often. So I do beetroot juice and a whole host of other things. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint the exact effects of IMST for me specifically, but I guess anecdotally, maybe when I'm running at a high intensity, perhaps it's a little bit easier where I'm moving and I'm saying, I'm not quite as out of breath than maybe I would expect. But again, it's quite tough to, whether that's anecdotal from just training more or the IMST, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and it's hard, like you said, when you're doing multiple interventions kind of on yourself at once, it's hard to isolate the effects. So, you have to run the randomized controlled trial. You have to do sort of like the elimination diet type thing, where you add one thing at a time versus, oh yeah, if you're doing beetroot juice, IMST, sauna, all at the same time, it's like, well, what's explaining these effects? It's probably all of it.
Right.
For sure. And so I'm curious as to what the mechanisms are by which inspiratory muscle strength training can improve blood pressure. Obviously, I see sort of the direct benefit on breathing and the dyspnea. You're increasing the strength of the lungs. It's literally kind of, training your lungs to become stronger in a way. But what about the effects on blood pressure? What are, if you're aware of, maybe the mechanistic studies haven't been done, but what are some of the hypothesized or proposed mechanisms that are mediating the blood pressure effects of IMST?
Yeah, there's a few things, and a lot of this mechanistic work has been led by Dr. Craig Head at UC Boulder. And a few things that they're addressing. One is nitric oxide bioavailability and vascular function changes. Part of that might be mediated from the large shear stress that occurs. So shear stress is, as increased blood flow, you get endothelial dependent dilation. And also the other thing is with the large blood volume changes, or central blood volume changes, at least with breathing, because of course you're inhaling completely, exhaling completely with some resistance, whether or not that changes how much shear stress specifically on the carotid arteries, which of course is a site of sensitivity for blood pressure. So the baroreceptors, which sense blood pressure, are there. So whether the specific area that you're having all that shear stress occur has an effect is unclear, but actually Dr. Craig Head, he has an ongoing study funded by the NIH to look at that specifically. But something else, it could just be that you're working a muscle that is the diaphragm and the intercostals. And perhaps if you're not an exerciser, there is some muscular adaptations that occur with standard aerobic training or exercise training, which is reductions in inflammation, improvements in some of the other things that we were talking about, like glucose disposal. And, I'm not saying that working the diaphragm is going to have the same systemic effects as others, but, all those little things put together maybe do have an effect.
No, certainly. And, like you said, it's not the, high intensity whole body like interval exercise. So maybe you're not going to, use a lot of like blood glucose or glycogen during this training, but there could be some tiny component there that's very interesting. And, the body, I would assume, would get some sort of inflammatory response, which could upregulate, antioxidants and reduce oxidative stress when used chronically. So I'm sure,
Right.
all of those mechanisms are contributing, but it is very interesting. And I'm sure also maybe some autonomic kind of nervous system regulation type stuff going on in there as well.
Yeah. And I didn't speak to that, but I certainly think so. One is just the direct relation between breathing and vagal tone in the body, which is, vagal tone, parasympathetic nervous system, and heart rate regulation. And the other is just thinking about your breathing and controlling your breathing and what effects that might have on just calming your autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic branch. It could be that interplay also sort of just, again, these little hits of all the things that can help reduce blood pressure. And maybe it's different in different people, but those are all certainly things that can contribute.
No, definitely. I think it almost just seems like, not only could it be a beneficial training effect, but just like, I don't know, taking 5 minutes per day to like focus on breathing. I think I might just get one of the devices just for that to, zone out and focus on breathing for like 5 minutes, almost the way of like meditation, where you're also getting some cardiovascular benefits of it.
Right.
But a lot better than the altitude training masks, that I always kind of rag on when I see people wearing those in the gym. But IMST definitely at least seems to have some efficacy behind it.
Right. Efficacy, multiple populations, multiple researchers. So yeah, it's a promising intervention that a lot of people are excited about, and I think there's a lot of questions that can be answered that can help people.
No, definitely. And I'm very excited to see, the work coming out of your lab in the coming years on this data. It's very, very exciting stuff. Lastly, before we go, I would just like to, see if you have anything else to add regarding, some important or maybe other lifestyle factors contributing to cardiovascular disease that you're particularly interested in, or, if there are any that you think stand out, above blood pressure. There we have sleep and diet and things like that. But, what are you interested in? Just maybe not necessarily a question that you're researching physically in your laboratory, but, what are some of just the other lifestyle factors that you are particularly interested in?
Sure. So, I also am a follower of Dr. Andrew Huberman, so you may be familiar with him as well. And a lot of the things related to psychology that might be underappreciated when you think about physical health is taking the time every day to go view sunlight, getting up in the morning and spending a few minutes. And you don't need to be doing IMST, you don't need to be doing specific breathing, but just trying to take time throughout the day to just sort of unwind and just think about what you're doing and just be thoughtful with what you're spending your time and attention and everything. Because a lot of times it'll just build up throughout the day, and then all of a sudden you just have this unwind quickly into bed. But if you can throughout the day sort of think about what am I doing and be a little bit cognizant, that might help you. For one, it might just make you appreciate life a little bit more, but another, maybe you'll make better decisions because you're thinking, oh, why am I eating this? I'm actually not hungry right now. Or, oh, you know what? I feel like going up and moving around. Maybe I'm going to go, take a break and walk outside for 5 minutes. So I think those are things that are good. And also, working with a group too. When I was in Dallas, we had a little workout group where we would get together a couple times a week. And, at that point, we're of course building our health and everything, but, just the camaraderie and just, the social aspects. So exercise can be fun. So whether it's playing volleyball or taking your dog for a walk or dancing or whatever it is, just find different things that have these beneficial effects both socially and physically, and you'll likely find that all those things will contribute to improve health as you also consider the exercise, nutrition, the body mass regulation, all those other sort of classical cardiovascular factors.
No, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because it kind of gets into this more like esoteric aspect of health. We can obviously, being, researchers and physiologists, it's obviously easy to focus on how does what you eat and, what you're doing, what workout regimen you're doing, or how often you're doing the sauna, like how does this affect health? But you know, like you mentioned, often we don't really think about just the effects of being present or being around people or socialization. So unfortunately, like from a research perspective, those are harder things to investigate,
Yeah.
right? Like how do you research, oh, how thoughtful am I during the day? And so that's kind of why I think they're given less attention, because you can't really research that or really even quantify it. So it's less like sexy, I guess, you know, from a scientific standpoint. But I think you hit the nail on the head in that, like, just being aware of things throughout the day and thinking about things rather than just mon- automatically going from one thing to the next during the day, and just eating when we think we're supposed to, or doing this or that because someone said so. Just be conscious of, like, what you're doing and what you're putting in your mouth, and how you're interacting with people. All those are definitely important, and they do really have a tangible effect on health. If we were able to measure them somehow, I'm sure we could find that. But yeah, the environment, who you're around, all of these things play an important aspect in health. So for I think it's important to hear from researchers that those things are important as well. And like you said, I think more people are becoming aware of that because of the science communication efforts from people obviously like yourself, but also people like Andrew Huberman, who are making these things aware, and people are becoming more conscious. So it's cool to see that everyone seems to be interested in improving their health and ways to do it. So I think we spend a lot of time today talking about the prevalence of disease and negative risk factors in society, but it seems like awareness is at least increasing, and maybe the data wouldn't indicate we're moving in the right direction, but the general kind of vibe would indicate that at least people are becoming more aware of things. So who knows, maybe we're moving in an upward direction in terms of health in society. But it often can seem like that, but then again, we're also involved in our little circle where it may seem like more people are aware of health than the most of the population actually are. So sometimes that's hard to deal with as well.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, it'd be interesting. I'm not sure what intervention you would do. Perhaps an app that blacks out your phone and laptop for 30 seconds every hour. The first 10 seconds would be go ahead and be angry, count down from 10. Okay, now take 10 seconds and think about what you're doing, and just breathe for a second.
Yeah,
But
for sure. Otherwise, yeah, we'll have to hook everybody up with these IMST devices too, so they can just take 5 minutes out every few times per day.
right.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
Joe, I had a great time chatting with you today. And before we go, can you just let listeners know where they can find you, whether that be on social media, if you have a laboratory website that they can visit to find more about your public outreach efforts and the work that your lab's doing, et cetera?
Yeah. So the caplaboratory.com, caplaboratory.com, that's where we have a lot of information related to the lab, the research, some public outreach stuff. And Twitter is at Joseph_Watso. I'm not quite as active on there as I once was, but I do post things from time to time.
Okay, awesome. And I'll include, links to all that in the show notes. But you have a great lab website. I mean, it's cool, not only, from the ability to learn about your published work and people in the lab, but also, like I mentioned, you have a public outreach section where you kind of have many little blog posts. So I would encourage people to definitely check that out. But, once again, Joe, thanks again for chatting with me today. I had a great time, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of the work that you publish in the coming years.
Great. Yeah. Thanks. This was a lot of fun. Talk soon.
Yep. Sounds good. Bye.
Bye.